Hello, my dear friends. They said New York never slept, but in the 1800s, some nights it wished it could. Beneath the glow of wealth and progress, the city rotted from the inside, its slums pulsing with hunger, sickness, and the quiet screams of those no one cared to hear. Every ally was a trap, every room a grave waiting to be filled. This was not a city of dreams, but of survival measured in breaths. Tonight, you will walk through its darkness, feel the cold walls close in, and discover what it truly means to live and die in the forgotten night of New York slums. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let us embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to stand at the edge of New York slums in the 1800s as night began to settle, the first thing to strike the senses would not be the darkness, but the smell. It clung to every wall, every garment, and every breath, a presence so thick it felt almost alive. The air was heavy with the stench of human waste, spoiled food, and rotting animals left on the streets to decay, their bodies slowly melting into the cobblestones beneath the weight of time and neglect. The heat of the day faded into a damp chill, yet the odor thickened as though the night itself was exhaling poison, breathing out the accumulated misery of thousands who had no choice but to inhale it again and again. There was no escape from it, no corner of relief, no moment of freshness. Every alley became a tunnel of filth, and every gust of wind carried something foul, something that made the stomach turn and the throat close. The smell was not just unpleasant, it was a presence, alive and constant, reminding everyone that cleanliness was a privilege that did not belong here, that purity was a fantasy reserved for streets far above, where carriages rolled and ladies walked with perfumed handkerchiefs pressed to their noses. The fog rose quietly from the sewers and gutters, merging with smoke from cheap coal and the fumes of spilled gin, creating a haze that seemed to have weight and substance. Lamps flickered behind layers of grime, unable to pierce the haze, their light swallowed before it could reach more than a few feet. What hung in the air was not mere mist, but a slow-moving poison rolling through the narrow lanes and into the throats of the people trying to breathe, trying to survive another night in a place that seemed determined to suffocate them. It was as if the entire city had decided to rot together slowly, patiently, without protest, accepting its decay as inevitable. The mixture of damp smoke and waste made the air feel thick enough to chew, each breath stinging the lungs with a sharpness that never dulled, each exhale coming with a taste of metal that coated the tongue and refused to leave. For those living in these tenements, this was the smell of survival, familiar and unremarkable, as ordinary as the color of the sky or the feel of hunger in the belly. Inside the cramped rooms, windows were either broken or sealed with rags, torn pieces of old clothing stuffed into frames to keep out the cold, though they did nothing to stop the smell. Wool absorbed the odor until even clean water, if one could find any, smelled faintly of decay, as though the very essence of rot had seeped into every molecule. The night pressed down like a wet blanket, heavy and cold, making every piece of clothing cling to the skin, damp and uncomfortable. Outside, puddles of stagnant water reflected faint light from above, from distant windows where the wealthy dined and laughed, but the reflections trembled with each passing rat, distorting into shapes that looked almost monstrous in the darkness. Every sound was muffled by the fog, creating an eerie quietness that made the occasional scream or laughter from a distant tavern sound almost unreal, as though it came from another world entirely, a world where joy still existed. No one could truly rest in this place. The dampness found its way into every mattress, every blanket, every lung, settling deep where it could not be coughed out or wiped away. The air carried not only disease, but despair, a heaviness that weighed on the soul as much as the body. Even the most ordinary gestures, drawing a breath, wiping a face, swallowing saliva, felt tainted, corrupted by the environment that surrounded them. It is almost comical to imagine anyone in such a place talking about fresh air, because freshness was a myth that did not exist here, a concept as foreign as silk sheets or warm baths. The poor had learned to live with the unbearable simply because there was no alternative, no escape route, no door that led to anything better. The human body, after all, adapts to nearly anything if forced to, reshaping itself around suffering until suffering becomes the new normal. As the night deepened, so did the haze, thickening until it felt like walking through water, every movement slow and labored. From a distance, the slum looked almost peaceful with its faint lights and drifting mist, like a painting of a quiet village settling in for the evening. But up close, the stillness carried menace, a tension that made the skin prickle and the heart beat faster. Rats scratched beneath wooden boards, their claws making a sound like whispered secrets, and the faint drip of water echoed endlessly, each drop marking time in a place where time meant only more suffering. The fog trapped every smell and sound, turning the slums into an enclosed world where air itself felt like an infection, something that entered the body and spread sickness from the inside out. For the residents, breathing was an act of endurance, a daily battle against an environment that seemed designed to kill them slowly. The lungs filled with filth, but the mind learned to ignore it, to accept it as part of existence, as normal as hunger or cold. People moved slowly, wrapped in layers of damp fabric that never dried, their clothes reeking of sweat and smoke, worn day after day because there were no others. Children with bare feet stepped through puddles slick with oil, their toes turning blue from the cold, unaware that the same air making them cough was also what their parents had breathed for years, what their grandparents had breathed before them, creating generations shaped by poison. In this place, dirt became identity, and smell became memory, a mark that followed them wherever they went. Every odor told a story of hunger, neglect, or death, each one a chapter in a book no one wanted to read. The fog itself was treacherous, hiding more than it revealed. It hid the holes in the ground, gaps where cobblestones had been pried up and never replaced, creating traps for unwary feet. It hid the corpses waiting to be collected, bodies that had lain in the street for hours or days, covered with old newspapers or sacks, ignored until the smell became too much even for this place. It hid the faces of strangers who might not be safe to approach, men with knives in their belts and desperation in their eyes, women driven to madness by grief or hunger. Those who walked through it could lose direction within a few streets, as if the city swallowed them whole, turning familiar paths into mazes where every turn looked the same. If one were to describe this air in modern terms, it would be like standing in the exhaust of thousands of factories, breathing poison disguised as weather, choking on the byproducts of progress. The difference is that in Victorian New York, no one thought of leaving, because leaving required money, connections, and hope, three things that did not exist in the slums. The slum was not a temporary misfortune, but a permanent condition, a place people were born into and died in, their entire lives contained within a few filthy blocks. In the midst of it, the human senses dulled, smell lost meaning, taste was distorted, and the line between cleanliness and decay disappeared entirely. People drank water that shimmered faintly with oil, cooked food that carried the taste of soot, and slept beside walls streaked with mold, their bodies pressed against surfaces that felt alive with moisture and rot. The body resisted for a while, then surrendered, accepting the inevitable. Coughs became constant companions, a soundtrack to every day. Skin erupted in sores that never fully healed. The scent of the slum was not only around them, but inside them, part of their very being, woven into their flesh and blood. When rain came, it offered a brief illusion of cleansing, the sound of droplets striking tin roofs and broken glass feeling soothing, like nature attempting to wash away human sin. But the water only stirred the rot, releasing new waves of odor, turning the streets into rivers of filth that carried everything downhill. In the morning, the puddles shimmered with the colors of waste, rainbows of oil and sewage that children sometimes mistook for beauty. Flies gathered where the fog thinned, drawn by the scent of decay, and the air became thick again, the brief respite over. It was a cycle that never ended, a rhythm as reliable as the seasons. The night's poison became the morning's breath, and the morning's breath became the afternoon's headache, and so on, endlessly. There was no point in complaining, no authority that cared to listen. No official, no doctor, no reformer came to walk these streets after sunset when the true nature of the slums revealed itself. The poor were left to inhale whatever the city expelled, to breathe in the refuse of the wealthy, the smoke from their factories, the waste from their homes. The smell marked them, branded them, followed them even when they ventured beyond the slums, announcing their origins before they could speak. It was a scent that told the world where they belonged, what they were worth, how little they mattered. The air did not just fill their lungs, it defined their existence, shaped their identities, determined their fates. There was no point in complaining, no authority that cared to listen. No official, no doctor, no reformer came to walk these streets after sunset when the true nature of the slums revealed itself. The poor were left to inhale whatever the city expelled, to breathe in the refuse of the wealthy, the smoke from their factories, the waste from their homes. The smell marked them, branded them, followed them even when they ventured beyond the slums, announcing their origins before they could speak. It was a scent that told the world where they belonged, what they were worth, how little they mattered. The air did not just fill their lungs, it defined their existence, shaped their identities, determined their fates. I often imagine what it would be like to take a single breath there, knowing the air itself carried the weight of death, feeling it coat the inside of the mouth and throat, sensing the corruption entering the body. The thought lingers, not because of the horror, but because of the indifference that allowed it to persist, the callousness of a society that could build grand buildings and beautiful parks while letting human beings suffocate a few streets away. The stench was not a warning, it was background, a constant part of life that no one questioned anymore, as normal as the rising sun or the changing seasons. The night in the slums of New York was not silent, but it was suffocating, pressing against the skin and entering the soul, a presence that could not be fought or escaped. Those who lived within it learned to move slowly, to breathe carefully, to exist without expecting relief, because relief was not coming. The fog was not just weather, it was the slum's breath, the city's way of reminding them they were trapped, that the walls around them were not made of brick but of neglect. The air that coated every face and cloth told a truth words could not, that cleanliness was impossible and purity was a lie, a story told to children who lived in better places. The poor did not merely live in the stench, they became it, absorbed it, carried it wherever they went, spreading it like a contagion. It was the scent of poverty turned permanent, invisible yet inescapable, a ghost that followed them through every moment of their lives. The night's breath was poison, and yet it was all they had, the only air available, the only atmosphere in which they could exist. The fog did not just hide the filth, it became part of it, seeping into every life it touched, changing them from the inside out. In those streets, survival meant inhaling corruption and pretending not to notice, turning a blind eye to what could not be changed, accepting the unacceptable because there was no other choice. The darkness thickened, and with it the illusion of peace, a false calm that settled over the slums like a shroud. Beneath that quiet, life decayed slowly, wrapped in fog and indifference, forgotten by the world above. The smell was not only proof of poverty, but of abandonment, evidence that society had turned its back on these people, decided they were not worth saving. The night's air was not just heavy, it was haunted by everything the city refused to clean, every problem it refused to solve, every injustice it refused to acknowledge. The air that suffocated the slums was more than a foul presence. It was the first sign of what waited deeper inside, the first warning that beneath the surface lay horrors even darker than the smell itself. The homes, the alleys, and the people themselves were soaked in this rot, marinated in misery until they could no longer remember what anything else felt like. Beneath that breathless fog, something worse stirred in the darkness, where even the faintest light could not reach, where hope had died so long ago that no one remembered its name. The alleys of the slums were narrow and endless, twisting between collapsing walls and leaking drains, like the intestines of some great dying beast. At night, they became corridors of blindness, passages so dark that even those who knew them well sometimes lost their way. The oil lamps that once lined the streets were broken or stolen, their metal frames left to rust against the walls, creating sharp edges that tore at clothing and skin. Only a few faint glimmers came from distant windows, but even those were swallowed by the fog that hung low over the ground, turning everything into shadow. The darkness was not simple absence of light. It was a substance of its own, thick and alive, moving with the damp air, pressing against the skin like cold hands. The ground glistened faintly where puddles caught the faintest reflections, tiny mirrors of a world that had forgotten beauty. The smell of stagnant water rose with every step, mixing with the odor of rotting vegetables and human waste, creating a bouquet of decay. It was hard to tell where the earth ended and the filth began, everything blending together into one slick, treacherous surface. In these alleys, people walked slowly, not because they wanted to, but because they had to, because speed meant danger. The ground was uneven, littered with shards of glass, bones picked clean by rats, and pieces of discarded metal that could slice through a shoe in seconds. Every few steps, the foot would slip on something soft that gave way under pressure, and often it was better not to know what it was, better to keep moving and not look down, not think about what might be beneath. The water that collected in the cracks reflected faint lights, but beneath the surface floated dead rats, swollen and pale, their bodies bloated with gases. The sight no longer shocked anyone. It was as common as the cobblestones themselves. It is strange how quickly the human mind accepts horror when it becomes daily routine, how the extraordinary transforms into the mundane through repetition. The sound of footsteps echoed against the narrow walls, creating a rhythm that seemed louder than it should have been, amplified by the enclosed space. When one person walked through the alley, it sounded as if many were following, as if an army of ghosts marched in the darkness. In the silence of the night, even a single movement drew attention, every scrape of a shoe, every rustle of clothing. The wind carried whispers that no one spoke, carried the scraping of something hard against the stones, and the faint splash of unseen creatures scurrying through the puddles, their tiny feet pattering like rain. To the residents, these noises were warnings, signs that could mean the difference between safety and danger. The wise ones stopped walking when they heard too much, because noise could mean trouble, could mean someone was nearby who should not be, someone with intentions that were better avoided. Every wall bore stains of things long spilled and never washed away, creating patterns like abstract art, paintings of suffering. Layers of soot and moisture made the surfaces sticky to the touch, as if the walls themselves were sweating, exuding the fear and pain they had absorbed over decades. The air was colder here than on the main streets, as though the alleys held on to the dampness of years, trapping it between their narrow walls like a living thing. Windows above were small and tightly shut, leaking only thin lines of dim light that could not reach the ground, that died before they could illuminate anything useful. Sometimes a window opened and dirty water poured out, mixing with the sludge below, adding another layer to the filth. The people below did not complain. They simply stepped aside and went on, accepting this as normal, as just another part of life in the slums. The silence of these streets was deceptive, a lie that covered constant motion. Somewhere a bottle would break, the sound sharp and sudden, making hearts skip. A door would slam, the noise echoing like a gunshot. A woman's voice would cry out, only to vanish as quickly as it came, swallowed by the darkness. The alleys absorbed every sound, swallowing it whole, making it impossible to tell direction or distance. It was difficult to tell whether something had really happened or if the mind invented it to make sense of the quiet, to fill the void with something, anything, even if it was frightening. If one were to compare this to the modern world, it would be like walking through a city after a power outage where every corner hides both fear and familiarity, where the ordinary becomes threatening simply because it cannot be seen clearly. Yet in the slums, this was not temporary. This was the natural state of night, the way things had always been and always would be. For the poor, the darkness served as both a shield and a threat, a paradox they lived with every day. It hid them from the eyes of the police and the rich, allowed them to move unseen, to conduct business that would not survive daylight. But it also hid those who preyed on them, concealed danger until it was too late to run. Many crimes began with a faint sound, a shuffle in the darkness, a whisper barely heard, the strike of a match illuminating a face for just a second, and ended before anyone could react, before a scream could fully form. The victims were left lying in the wet dirt, their blood diluted by filthy water that carried it down the gutter like just another stain. The next morning, the stains looked no different from the rest of the alley, just another dark patch among many, and life continued as if nothing had happened. Some families who could not afford rooms slept near the entrances of these alleys, huddled against walls or tucked into corners that offered some protection from the wind. They lit small fires in tin cans to keep warm, the smoke blending with the mist until it disappeared, adding to the haze. Children huddled against their mothers, their eyes reflecting the faint glow, wide and watchful. Every time a shadow moved, they froze, holding their breath, pressing closer together. The night was not meant for sleeping. It was something to be endured, survived. There is something deeply unsettling about imagining those nights, where fear was so ordinary that people stopped recognizing it, where terror became routine and routine became life. The puddles never dried, even on days without rain, because moisture gathered constantly from leaking roofs and overflowing drains. The water carried the reflection of whatever faint light touched it, making it look almost beautiful from a distance, like tiny pieces of sky fallen to earth. Up close, the illusion shattered completely. Layers of waste floated on the surface, grease from cooking, ash from fires, and human refuse creating a film that shimmered with unnatural colors. When someone stepped into the puddle, bubbles rose, carrying up a smell so strong it felt solid, so overwhelming it made eyes water and throats close. People covered their noses with sleeves, but it made little difference. The smell clung anyway, as everything else in the slum did, refusing to be washed away or forgotten. Rats ruled these passages more confidently than humans, more at home in the darkness than those who walked upright. They darted in and out of cracks, fearless and numerous, their eyes catching what little light there was, turning into small, moving sparks in the blackness. For some, the sight of rats meant company, a reminder that they were not entirely alone. They were the only living things that never left, that remained loyal to the slums through every season, every plague, every hardship. No matter how cold or dark the night became, the rats stayed. Killing them was useless, a waste of energy, because they always returned, multiplying faster than they could be eliminated, an enemy that could never be defeated. The few lamps that still functioned flickered weakly, their light orange and trembling, unstable as everything else here. Oil was expensive, and the city rarely refilled the public posts, preferring to spend money on streets where important people walked. Some residents made their own lamps with scraps of cloth soaked in grease, twisted into makeshift wicks, but the smoke they produced was thick and choking, darker than the night itself. It darkened the walls further, turning everything black and wet, leaving residue that built up in layers. The more light they tried to create, the more suffocating the air became, a cruel irony that meant visibility came at the cost of breathability. When fog and darkness mixed, the alleys seemed to breathe, to expand and contract like living lungs. The walls appeared to move slightly, as if the city itself was alive and restless, shifting in its sleep. Anyone unfamiliar with the slums could easily lose their way, turned around by the maze of identical passages. The alleys were designed by accident, not by planning, a web of paths that led nowhere, each one darker and narrower than the last. Some ended abruptly at brick walls, dead ends that trapped the unwary. Others opened into small yards filled with trash and silence, spaces that felt like outdoor rooms, enclosed and secret. Those who wandered too far often turned back quickly, uneasy at what they might find, sensing danger even if they could not see it. It was said that you could hear the city breathe if you stood still long enough in those alleys, and it was true in a way. The sound was not human, but it was real, coming from the slow dripping of water, the crackling of hidden fires, and the faint rustling of creatures unseen. Together, they formed a kind of heartbeat that reminded everyone that the slum was awake, even when its people slept, that it lived and watched and waited. The darkness was not empty, despite appearances. It watched with 1,000 invisible eyes, listened with ears that caught every whisper, every sob, every prayer. People adapted because they had no choice, because survival demanded it. They learned to walk by memory, to sense the shapes around them without seeing, to navigate by touch and sound. Children grew up tracing the walls with their fingers, learning each turn and each hole by feel, creating mental maps more detailed than any drawing. In a place where vision failed, instinct became the only guide, the only thing that could be trusted. The darkness did not scare them anymore, not in the way it would frighten outsiders, because fear requires the energy they did not have. Instead, it shaped them, molded them into creatures of shadow, half-blind and hyper-aware, their other senses sharpened by constant use. The alleys of the slums were more than pathways. They were graves for the city's forgotten, arteries that carried waste instead of blood, veins that pulsed with misery instead of life. The absence of light was not the problem, not really, because light would only reveal what was better left unseen. It was the proof that no one cared enough to provide it, evidence of abandonment. The streets above had gas lamps and polished stones, illumination and order, while here the ground itself seemed to reject illumination, to prefer darkness, as if hiding from judgment. The poor learned to live as shadows because no one wanted to see them, because visibility meant vulnerability, exposure. In that blindness, life went on quietly, almost secretly, as if the darkness had become the only truth left. The darkness of the alleys was not just physical, it was moral, social, existential. It was the measure of how deeply the city ignored its poor, how completely it had turned its back on suffering. The silence there carried the weight of invisible crimes, of acts that would never be reported or punished. Somewhere beyond these walls, behind a door left ajar, something was always waiting for the next sound to break it, the next victim to stumble into the trap. The rooms inside the slums were smaller than imagination could allow, smaller than modern minds can truly comprehend. They were built not for comfort, but for containment, designed to pack as many bodies as possible into the smallest space, maximizing profit for landlords who never saw the consequences of their greed. Families crowded into spaces so tight that standing upright was sometimes impossible, where arms could touch opposite walls simultaneously, where the ceiling pressed down like a lid on a coffin. There were no windows, no vents, no openings except a narrow doorway that led into another identical cell, creating a warren of human storage. The walls dripped with moisture that never dried, water seeping through from leaking pipes and rain-soaked bricks, running in thin streams that left dark trails. The air was heavy with human breath, with the exhalations of too many lungs in too small a space. Each room seemed to hold the accumulated breathing of 100 nights, layer upon layer of carbon dioxide and desperation. The smell of sweat, cold smoke, and sickness blended into something permanent, something that had become part of the structure itself. The very bricks seemed to reek, having absorbed years of human odor until they could never be clean again. The walls had witnessed everything, birth and death, violence and tenderness, and they remembered it all in the stains that covered their surfaces. The floor was not wood, at least not in the traditional sense, but a patchwork of planks, crates, and occasionally bare earth showing through gaps. When one person moved, the entire surface shifted with them, creaking and groaning, threatening to collapse. Children slept beside their parents, pressed close like spoons in a drawer, arranged by size to fit as many as possible. 6, sometimes 10 people shared the same wooden platform, the same thin blanket that provided almost no warmth, the same stale air that grew thinner as the night progressed. The warmth of their bodies was their only defense against the cold that crept in through every crack. But that warmth carried its own discomfort, creating a humid heat that made the air feel even thicker. Sweat dampened the sheets until they were soaked, and coughs spread through the air without resistance, passing from one person to the next like a shared secret. It is almost absurd that people still called such places homes when they resembled sealed boxes for slow suffocation more than dwellings meant for human habitation. The word home implies safety, comfort, a place of refuge, but these rooms offered none of that, only the bare minimum required to keep bodies from dying immediately. There was no silence, even when voices were quiet, because sound seeped through the walls as easily as water. Groans from the room next door, crying from the family above, coughing from below, the scraping of furniture being moved, the sound of something breaking and then cursing. It came from above, below, and every side, merging into a constant low roar that never stopped, that made true silence impossible. Sleep never arrived gently here, never crept in with soft edges and peaceful dreams. It came as exhaustion, as collapse, as the body simply giving up and shutting down because it could not remain conscious any longer. Every dream was interrupted by a noise, a smell, or a movement in the dark, jerking sleepers back to consciousness only to drag them down again moments later. The sense of privacy had long been erased, worn away by years of living so close that everyone could hear everything. Everyone heard everyone else, every whispered argument, every intimate moment, every bout of sickness. When food was cooked, its scent filled every crevice of the building, drifting through the thin walls and under doors, making empty stomachs growl. When someone vomited, the sound and smell carried to the next family within moments, causing sympathetic nausea. It was impossible to distinguish one odor from another after a while. Everything blended together into a single, overwhelming assault on the senses. The air stood still, so dense that it seemed to press against the skin like a physical weight, making movement feel labored. If we compared this to the modern world, it would be like trapping 10 people in a small elevator for days without air circulation or escape and expecting them to call it living, to somehow create lives and find happiness in that tiny box. Yet for these families, it was routine, so common that they did not question it because there was nowhere else to go, no alternative available. At night, the room grew hotter rather than colder, a strange inversion of normal temperature cycles. The bodies inside produced enough warmth to turn the space into a furnace despite the cold outside, heat accumulating with no way to escape. Sheets stuck to the skin, clinging uncomfortably, and breaths grew shallow as oxygen levels dropped. Infants whimpered in the dark, their small bodies overheating, and mothers rocked them gently, though the motion did nothing to ease the heat, only created more friction and warmth. The sound of breathing filled the space like a tide, uneven and weary and endless, a constant reminder of too many people in too small a space. There were moments when it felt as if the entire building inhaled together and exhaled death, moments when the collective breathing seemed to synchronize into one great labored wheeze. The walls themselves seemed alive in the flickering candlelight, moving and shifting as shadows danced across them. Mold crawled up from the floor, forming patterns that looked like spreading roots, like veins in a diseased body, black and green tendrils reaching upward. Water stains marked every surface, evidence of leaks from above, from the floor overhead where another family lived in identical conditions. The plaster cracked in long lines, creating fissures through which insects emerged at night, moving silently along the edges of the room. Some families hung cloths soaked in vinegar from the ceiling, believing it might purify the air or at least mask the worst of the smell, but it only added another layer to the confusion of odors, sharp and acidic. A candle burned in the corner, providing the only light, its flame wavering each time someone shifted or coughed, threatening to go out. The shadows it cast made the room look smaller than it actually was, made faces look older and eyes deeper, created the illusion that the walls were closing in. The heat from the candle added to the heaviness, made the air even warmer, but without it, the darkness was unbearable, complete and smothering. They did not fear the dark itself, but what moved within it. The insects that crawled across skin in sleep. The rats that sometimes entered through holes in the walls. The unseen dangers that lurked in every shadow. The floorboards creaked under every motion, groaning as if in pain, threatening collapse. Sometimes, when the building groaned from wind or weight, from the strain of holding up so many desperate lives, people thought it might collapse, and sometimes it did. Whole families vanished under rubble, crushed in seconds, their screams cut short. By morning, new tenants had already moved into the repaired shell, desperate enough to risk death for a roof over their heads, willing to sleep where others had died because they had no choice. In this part of the city, tragedy was a brief interruption, quickly forgotten because dwelling on death meant drowning in it. It always unsettles me to imagine that people could grow used to living like this, as if endurance itself was a form of pride, as if survival in such conditions was something to celebrate rather than mourn. The rooms above were no better, often worse, because heat rose and air did not. Air did not rise in a healthy way, bringing freshness. Instead, it thickened and stagnated. The higher one went, the more suffocating it became, temperatures climbing with each floor. Ceilings were low, so low that taller men had to stoop constantly, their backs aching from the unnatural posture. Children drew shapes on the walls with their fingers, tracing the outline of stains that resembled continents, countries, animals, creating imaginary worlds in the patterns of mold and water damage. Some laughed as they did it, turning misery into a game, because children possess a resilience that adults have lost, an ability to find joy even in horror. The laughter did not last long, though. The coughs always returned, hacking sounds that shook small frames and brought up blood in some cases. Illness moved from bed to bed like a shared language, passing between family members with inevitable progression. One person fell sick, then another, until the whole family coughed in unison, creating a chorus of suffering. Medicine was rare and expensive, far beyond the means of slum dwellers. People relied on superstition instead, on folk remedies and prayers. Burned herbs filled the room with acrid smoke. Whispered prayers were spoken over sick children. Pieces of coal hung above the door as protection against evil spirits. These rituals brought comfort, gave the illusion of control, but no cure. The air did not heal, could not heal. It only carried more sickness, circulating disease from room to room, floor to floor, building to building. The sound of neighbors could be heard clearly through the walls, as if there were no barriers at all. Arguments that turned violent, sobs that lasted for hours, and sometimes worse sounds that no one wanted to acknowledge. The buildings were made of thin boards that did not stop anything, not sound, not smell, not even secrets. The cries from one room bled into another until it was impossible to know where they began, creating a tapestry of human suffering. Children learned to sleep through it, trained by necessity to ignore sounds that would terrify adults in normal circumstances. Adults pretended not to hear, developing selective deafness as a coping mechanism, because acknowledging what happened next door meant accepting that it could happen to them. Sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, when exhaustion had silenced most of the building, a voice would rise unexpectedly. A hymn, soft and cracked, sung by a woman trying to calm a child, or from a man too tired to speak but too awake to rest, too haunted by thoughts to find peace. The song lingered in the heavy air for a few seconds before disappearing, absorbed by the walls like everything else. It was the closest thing to beauty that these rooms ever held, those brief moments of melody in the darkness, human voices trying to create something pure in a place of corruption. No one in these slums spoke of comfort, because comfort was a fantasy reserved for those who lived where the air moved freely, where windows opened to breezes and rooms had space to breathe. Here, breathing itself was labor, each inhalation requiring effort, each exhalation a small relief. The walls, soaked with years of human misery, seemed to pulse faintly at night, as if they had absorbed so much suffering that they had come alive. Every sigh echoed, bouncing off surfaces, and every whisper felt like it might wake something in the walls, some accumulated sadness that would overflow and drown them all. Morning brought no relief when it finally came. The air did not freshen with daylight, did not suddenly become easier to breathe. It only shifted slightly, blending night's sweat with the day's smoke from cooking fires. People rose from their boards, stretching stiff limbs that ached from sleeping on hard surfaces, preparing to face another day that looked exactly like the last. There was no rest in the true sense, only pauses between exhaustion, brief intervals where consciousness returned before the next wave of weariness hit. The crowded rooms of the slums were not simply shelters, they were slow deaths disguised as homes, places where life was measured in breaths taken rather than days lived. Yet within them, families held on with whatever strength remained. They laughed at small joys, argued over petty things, and dreamed in the same air that poisoned them, because dreaming was free and cost nothing but imagination. Survival was not resistance in any heroic sense, it was simply habit, the body continuing to function because it did not know how to stop. The rooms without windows held more than bodies. They held the city's forgotten breath, the exhalations of those deemed unworthy of clean air. What lingered in that trapped air was more than heat or smell. It was despair turned solid, misery given form and substance. Beyond those thin walls where families struggled to breathe, the noise of the living continued in other forms, but in the next darkness, something else was stirring, something that waited patiently for nightfall to claim its victims. Children in the slums did not dream in peace. Their sleep was too shallow for true rest, filled with twitches of fear and the sound of scratching nearby, sounds that penetrated even the deepest attempts at unconsciousness. The floor where they lay was not soft, offered no cushioning, only a layer of dirty straw spread thin across the ground like a cruel joke. The straw was damp, mixed with dust and bits of refuse that had accumulated over time, creating a bed more suited for animals than humans. When they moved, small clouds of powder rose into the air, catching faint light from a dying candle or the street's weak glow filtering through cracks, making the air sparkle briefly before settling again. The smell was a mixture of mold, smoke, and decay, the same scent that clung to every breath they took, that had become so familiar it no longer registered as unusual. Sleep did not bring rest here, it only offered a brief escape from hunger, a temporary disconnection from the gnawing emptiness in their bellies. The rats ruled the night without question, moving with confidence that suggested ownership. They crawled freely across floors, walls, and bodies, bold creatures who had learned that these humans posed no real threat. Some were bold enough to climb onto the straw piles where children slept, drawn by the smell of food crumbs caught in hair or clothing, or by the warmth of skin in the cold room. The smallest children flinched in their sleep when whiskers brushed their faces, when tiny clawed feet walked across their cheeks, but they rarely woke fully, too exhausted to respond. Sometimes the rats bit, their sharp teeth breaking skin easily, leaving marks that turned into sores that festered in the filthy air. It is grimly ironic that the only living creatures that treated these children equally were the rats, and even they came only to feed, only to take what little the children had left. The rooms were too crowded for protection, too packed with bodies to allow for any real defense. Blankets were thin, if they existed at all, offering no barrier against the tiny invaders, and mosquito nets were unheard of, luxuries that belonged to a different world. Many families simply covered their children with coats or rags, whatever fabric could be spared, laying it gently over small forms. The children curled into themselves, knees pulled to chests, faces hidden under arms, trying to make themselves as small as possible, as invisible as possible. Yet the rats always found them, always. They slipped between the straw and gnawed at fingers, toes, and ears, seeking any exposed flesh, any opportunity for a meal. In the morning, small scabs and bruises appeared on skin like quiet confessions of the night, marks that told stories no one wanted to hear. The cold added to the misery, seeping up from below. Without mattresses or bedding, without any real barrier between body and floor, the ground absorbed every ounce of body heat, draining warmth as fast as it could be generated. The straw was meant to insulate, to provide some protection, but it held moisture instead, dampness that made the cold worse, that conducted heat away from small bodies. The air was heavy with breath, with the exhalations of too many people in too small a space, and the smell of unwashed skin filled every corner, mixing with the scent of mold and decay. The candle burned low, melting into its own smoke, casting shadows that moved like living things, and still the rats moved, their activity constant and disturbing. The sound of their claws against wood became part of the rhythm of the night, as familiar as coughing or snoring, accepted because it could not be changed. Illness spread easily among them in these conditions, passing from child to child with inevitable progression. The children coughed through the hours, their small chests heaving with the effort, the sound wet and painful. Many had lungs already weakened by dust and cold, by breathing air that was more poison than oxygen. Wheezing became their lullaby, the soundtrack to their attempts at rest. Parents, exhausted from work and worry, hardly stirred when a child's cough turned to gasping, when breathing became a struggle. There were no doctors here, no medicine available, no help coming. The sick simply continued to breathe until they could not, until their bodies gave up the fight. If we were to imagine this in modern times, it would be like leaving children to sleep in the corner of a garbage dump, convinced that a thin layer of straw made it a home, acceptable somehow. The idea feels unthinkable now, but back then it was ordinary, so common that no one remarked on it. When morning came finally, bringing weak light, the children awoke slowly, sticky with sweat and grime despite the cold. The straw stuck to their hair, tangled in matted locks, and their faces were streaked with dirt, marked with lines where tears had run during the night. They rubbed their eyes with hands blackened by soot, hands that had touched too many filthy things, and crawled toward the nearest basin of gray water. Some splashed their faces, making minimal attempts at cleanliness. Others did not bother, because they knew cleanliness meant nothing when dirt returned within the hour, when the environment itself was dirty. The rats retreated only for daylight, hiding under floorboards or behind sacks, waiting patiently in the shadows. They would wait until night returned to reclaim their territory, to resume their feeding. Some children tried to chase the rats away, tried to assert some control over their space. They used sticks, stones, or shouts, whatever weapons they had, but it made little difference in the end. The rats were too many and the children too weak, the balance of power clear. Occasionally, one would catch a rat and kill it, holding it up like a small victory, like proof of their strength, but victory was meaningless when another dozen waited nearby, when the death of one rat changed nothing. It is disturbing how easy it is to imagine those small hands clutching a dead rat, feeling pride for a moment before hunger or fatigue dulled the feeling, before reality reasserted itself. The floor where they slept was not just dirty but alive in a sense, teeming with activity. Insects moved through the straw, feeding on waste and dead skin, creating their own ecosystem. The children scratched constantly, leaving red marks across their arms and legs, scores that sometimes bled. Their skin was thin, their bones visible under pale flesh that had not seen enough sunlight or nutrition. Even in sleep, their bodies twitched, reacting to unseen bites, to the constant assault. Their dreams, if they had any, were filled with fever and sound, with images as confused and dark as their waking hours. The stench of rot lingered long after the rats had gone into hiding. Dead ones lay in corners, bloated and stiff, their bodies decomposing slowly, blending into the floor. No one had the energy to remove them, to dispose of the corpses properly. The air in the room carried the faint sweetness of decay, the kind of smell that makes the stomach turn, that triggers instinctive revulsion. Flies gathered in small swarms around the bodies, moving lazily in the thick air, their buzzing adding to the cacophony of sounds. The children learned to ignore them because they had no choice, because acknowledging every horror meant being overwhelmed by horror. At night, when the sounds of the street faded, when the city grew as quiet as it ever did, the rustling grew louder. It was impossible to tell how many rats there were, impossible to count or track them all. They squeaked softly, brushing against the walls, searching for scraps, for anything edible. Sometimes in the quiet, a child whimpered without waking, making small sounds of distress. The movement of the rats was constant, a reminder that sleep was only partial surrender, that rest was never complete. The parents who watched over them felt the same helplessness, the same crushing sense of inadequacy. They covered their children's legs as best they could, brushed away the rats when they saw them, and prayed silently to gods who seemed not to hear, but prayers could not fill empty stomachs or clean the air, could not protect against creatures that owned the night. The children coughed, the rats fed, and life went on in its grim cycle. Death, when it came, was not sudden or dramatic. It was slow, gentle, and expected, as if the body itself understood that it had grown tired of fighting, that continuing required more strength than remained. The neighbors could hear it, could track the progression. The coughs, the quiet sobs, the restless turning, all the sounds passed through thin walls, spreading from one family to another like news. It was not grief anymore, not in the traditional sense, just part of the night's routine, another expected occurrence. When a child stopped coughing, when the small sounds ceased, it was noticed only by the silence left behind, by the absence rather than presence. The morning light that slipped through cracks in the walls revealed everything without mercy, showing what the darkness had hidden. Straw flattened from weight, stains dark from old blood, and the faint prints of rat feet in the dust, tiny tracks everywhere. The survivors rose and began another day, going through motions that had become automatic. They did not mourn because there was no time to mourn, because the living had to keep breathing in the same air that had killed their neighbors, had to continue somehow. For the children of the slums, the night was never restful, never peaceful. It was an endurance test, a lesson in stillness and silence. They learned not to cry, not to move unnecessarily, not to expect comfort because comfort did not exist here. The darkness was their blanket, thin and cold, and the rats their companions, unwanted but constant. It was life reduced to its barest form, existence without protection, innocence without peace. The nights with rats taught children more about fear than years of living ever could, taught them that the world was cruel and indifferent, that suffering was normal. The silence between their coughs carried the sound of surrender, of small bodies giving up battles they could not win. Beyond the walls where they struggled, something else was stirring, something that brought a cry that did not come from hunger, but from terror that the dark had not yet finished feeding on them. The nights in the slums were never truly quiet, never offered the silence that might bring peace. Beneath the coughing, the whispering, and the restless movements, there were sudden sounds that tore through the darkness like blades, screams that were sharp and brief, followed by silence too heavy to bear, too complete to feel natural. The alleys, narrow and slick with filth, carried these voices as if the walls themselves remembered them, amplifying and distorting them. A woman's cry might echo down the length of a street, hit the damped bricks, and vanish before anyone dared to open a door, before anyone could respond. The darkness swallowed everything, absorbed all evidence. Shame, pain, and witness all disappeared into the night as if they had never existed. In a place where survival demanded silence, where noise could bring danger, even horror had to be endured quietly, internalized rather than expressed. The screams came from behind thin walls or through open doorways, from spaces that should have been safe but never were. Women were attacked in the same corners where they washed clothes or prepared food, in places they had to use daily. The back doors of tenements were perfect traps, half hidden by barrels and piles of waste, creating blind spots where violence could unfold unseen. No one could see what happened there. The angles were wrong and the darkness too complete. But everyone could hear it. The sound of struggle, bodies hitting against wood, the dull thud of flesh on flesh, the low sobs that followed. These became part of the slum's nightly rhythm, expected sounds that marked the passage of hours. It is almost grotesque that the same streets where children played in daylight became hunting grounds by night, and no one called it unusual, no one suggested it should be different. Men with knives and quick hands roamed freely after dark, predators who knew these streets better than any police officer ever could. They understood every turn, every dead end, every escape route. The law rarely came this deep into the maze, rarely ventured far enough to matter. A shout for help was a whisper against the night, insignificant and easily ignored. The victims learned not to scream too long, learned that it changed nothing, that prolonging the sound only prolonged the violation. The predators did not flee when confronted by noise, and the neighbors did not intervene when they heard cries. Fear was stronger than pity, stronger than any sense of community or shared humanity. People locked their doors with bits of rope and old iron, whatever they could find, pressing their bodies against the wood as if that could stop what waited outside, as if physical weight could protect them from human evil. Inside the rooms, families listened because they had no choice, because the walls were too thin to hide the noise. They heard the begging, the pleading, the short bursts of struggle that turned quickly to quiet, to the terrible silence of surrender. The silence afterward was worse than the screams in many ways, more disturbing because it meant something had ended, some struggle had concluded. It lingered like smoke, thick and choking, filling the space between walls. Mothers covered their children's ears with gentle hands, trying to protect their innocence, while fathers stared at the floor, avoiding each other's eyes. No one looked at one another during these moments because eye contact would acknowledge what was happening, would require a response they could not give. When morning came, bringing its weak light, no one asked questions. The victims emerged pale, trembling, eyes hollow with shock and exhaustion. The others looked away, pretending not to notice the torn clothing or the bruises, pretending everything was normal. Sometimes the screams came from thieves caught in the act, from criminals who had chosen the wrong target. A man breaking into a room might meet another desperate enough to fight back, desperate enough to kill rather than be robbed. The struggle ended quickly, decided in seconds, with one lying still on the ground and the other vanishing into the fog before anyone could arrive. The city's filth did not care whose blood it absorbed, did not distinguish between victim and perpetrator. Knives were cheap, and so were lives, both available in abundance. The people in the slum knew this balance well, understood the economics of violence. If such things happened today, they would fill front-page headlines and bring crowds to protest, would spark outrage and demands for change. But back then, they passed like weather, like rain or fog, inevitable and soon forgotten. The police, when they arrived, did so hours later, after the evidence had been trampled or washed away. They lit their lamps, looked around briefly with expressions of disgust, and left with empty hands and empty notebooks. Reports were written in neat handwriting, filed in cabinets, but no one was punished. Justice did not belong to the poor, did not extend to streets like these. In the rare moments when an attacker was caught, when circumstances aligned and someone was actually arrested, the crowd turned quiet rather than celebratory. They feared retribution more than they desired fairness, understood that catching one criminal meant angering others. In these streets, punishment was a private matter, often delivered with a brick in the dark or a body found floating in the morning's river. Justice administered outside any official system. The darkness gave cover to every act, served as both accomplice and witness. It was both a tool and a character in every crime, active rather than passive. There were places in the slum where the light of any lamp never reached, corners so deep that even rats avoided them, sensing something wrong. Those who walked alone after midnight carried not just fear, but the knowledge that no one would come if they disappeared, that their absence might not be noticed for days. Every sound became suspicious in this environment, every shadow alive with potential threat. The screams of women were not the only ones that echoed through these streets, not the only evidence of suffering. Children cried out in fever, their small voices breaking in the dark. Drunks shouted curses at imagined enemies, at ghosts only they could see. Dying men muttered to people long dead, having conversations with empty air. But there was something different about the cries of violence, something that set them apart. They cut through the night with purpose, with an edge of urgency. They demanded to be heard, even when no one answered, even when help never came. The city itself seemed to flinch for a moment when these screams rang out, seemed to pause briefly before returning to breathing as if nothing had happened, as if human suffering was just another natural sound. It chills me to imagine that entire streets could sleep again minutes after such sounds, as though tragedy had become another lullaby, as soothing as rain on the roof. Neighbors who dared to speak the next day did so quietly, exchanging glances and a few words in hushed tones, nothing more. Some offered pity in careful whispers, others offered judgment, but none offered help, none suggested actually doing anything. The cycle continued, fed by itself. Fear taught them silence, and silence fed the next crime, creating a self-perpetuating system. It was a system too old to break, too established to challenge. The victims often moved away if they could, if they had the resources and the strength, leaving their rooms to new tenants who never asked what happened before, who did not want to know. The slum renewed itself by forgetting, by erasing history with each new arrival. Each night began as if the previous one had not existed, clean slate. But the air remembered, even when people forgot. It carried echoes that clung to the walls, faint vibrations that never truly faded, sounds absorbed into the bricks themselves. Every alley in the slum held its ghosts, not the spirits of the dead in any supernatural sense, but the memories of the terrified, the residue of trauma. The screams were not only sounds that dissipated into silence, they were marks on the place, stains no light could erase, permanent damage to the fabric of the location. The next woman who walked there would feel them even if she could not hear them, would sense the danger in her bones even if she could not explain why. The darkness was heavy because it carried too many voices that had nowhere else to go, too many unheard cries. Those who survived learned to move silently, to blend with the night, to become shadows themselves. They learned which corners to avoid, which steps creaked and would give away their position, which faces not to meet, which eye contact to avoid. Their fear was practical, measured, and constant, a tool for survival. Life continued not because it was safe, but because stopping meant surrender, meant admitting defeat. The city outside the slums pretended not to hear, maintained its willful ignorance. For them, the cries of the poor were background noise, as ordinary as the rumble of carriages or the ringing of church bells, part of the urban soundscape. The moral walls were thicker than the wooden ones in the tenements, more effective at blocking out reality. What happened in the dark stayed there, remained hidden. The nights of the slum were a theater without audience, where violence performed in whispers and ended in silence, where horror was routine entertainment for no one. Every cry lost in the fog became part of the city's pulse, beating in rhythm with its indifference, keeping time with its callousness. The screams that split the night revealed more than violence. They exposed the silence that allowed it to thrive, the complicity of everyone who heard and did nothing. Fear turned every wall into a shield and every neighbor into a stranger, transforming community into isolation. Somewhere deeper in the darkness, beneath that trembling quiet, the true meaning of survival was about to be tested in ways that made violence seem almost merciful. Hello, my dear friends. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing in the entrance of a cave carved deep into ancient stone, where the walls still carry the faint blackness of fires long extinguished. In that darkness, scattered among the ashes, lie small seeds crushed and charred, seeds that are not remnants of food nor fragments of fruit, but the earliest evidence of cannabis ever touched by human hands. These burnt offerings tell a story that stretches across millennia, a story of ritual and fear, of medicine and madness, of sacred smoke rising toward gods that humanity could not name but desperately needed to reach. Tonight, we wander through that story together, from the smoky caves of the Stone Age to the glowing dispensaries of the modern world, tracing the path of a plant that has been worshipped, outlawed, forgotten, and reborn more times than any empire could count. So before you settle too deeply into your pillows, if you find comfort in these journeys through history's shadows, consider joining us for more tales that drift between the forgotten and the familiar. Now, dim the lights around you, perhaps turn on a fan for that soothing background hum, and let us embark on this odyssey together tonight through the entire history of smoking weed. If one were to wander deep into the caves of the Stone Age, where firelight once danced against rough stone walls and the air was thick with the scent of survival, the atmosphere would still carry traces of something older than language itself. On those blackened walls, patches mark where fires once burned, not just for warmth or cooking, but for something far more mysterious. Tonight, we wander through that story together, from the smoky caves of the Stone Age to the glowing dispensaries of the modern world, tracing the path of a plant that has been worshipped, outlawed, forgotten, and reborn more times than any empire could count. So, before you settle too deeply into your pillows, if you find comfort in these journeys through history's shadows, consider joining us for more tales that drift between the forgotten and the familiar. Now, dim the lights around you, perhaps turn on a fan for that soothing background hum, and let us embark on this odyssey together tonight through the entire history of smoking weed. Among the ashes that archaeologists have carefully sifted through, small seeds lie crushed and charred, silent witnesses to humanity's first experiments with altered consciousness. They are not grains meant to nourish the body, nor the remains of fruit gathered for sustenance. They are cannabis seeds, burnt deliberately, their smoke inhaled by people who had no written prayers, no temples, no philosophy beyond the immediate need to survive another day in a world ruled by hunger, danger, and the relentless march of seasons. In the dim light of prehistory, these burnt seeds whisper a story of ritual born from curiosity, of fear softened by smoke, and of a strange search for peace in a landscape where peace was the rarest commodity of all. There were no scrolls to record what they felt, no prophets to interpret the visions that came, only the flicker of firelight casting shadows that danced like spirits across the cave walls, and the rise of smoke curling upward into the darkness above, carrying with it something that felt like connection to forces beyond human understanding. Those early humans, living in small tribes scattered across continents they did not yet know were continents, had little understanding of plants beyond the most basic categories of edible, poisonous, or useful for fuel. Their knowledge was built on observation and accident, passed down through gestures and grunts long before language could capture the subtlety of experience. Yet somehow, in the course of gathering plants and tending fires, they discovered something curious in the thick, fragrant smoke of cannabis. It dulled the senses in a way that felt different from exhaustion or sleep. It softened pain that otherwise gnawed constantly at bodies battered by the demands of survival. It made the mind drift into a haze that felt unlike ordinary rest, a state where the sharp edges of fear and hunger seemed to blur into something almost bearable. It was not medicine as we understand it today, measured and prescribed with precision, nor was it recreation as we imagine now, chosen deliberately for pleasure or escape. It was something in between, something that existed in the liminal space between necessity and mystery, a momentary reprieve from the relentless harshness that shaped every waking hour of their lives. It is almost amusing to think that humanity's first experiment with relaxation, with intentionally altering consciousness for reasons beyond immediate survival, might have begun with a group of exhausted hunters accidentally setting their future drug on fire while trying to stay warm through a long cold night. Archaeologists who study these ancient sites believe that the smoke was used during rituals where entire tribes gathered in circles around carefully tended fires, their faces illuminated by the orange glow, their eyes reflecting the flames that represented both danger and comfort. The flicker of those flames against the rough stone walls made shadows dance like spirits, like ancestors watching from beyond the veil of death, and the rising smoke was thought to carry messages to unseen powers that controlled the hunt, the weather, the fertility of the land. The smell of burning cannabis, though harsh and unfamiliar at first, became part of the ceremony itself, a scent that signaled the beginning of communion with something greater than the individual, something that connected the tribe to the world they could not control but desperately needed to understand. Without language sophisticated enough to explain the sensations they experienced, the experience itself became sacred. They breathed deeply, their eyes growing heavy, their hearts slowing to a rhythm that felt synchronized with the earth beneath them, as if touching a mystery that no one could name but everyone could feel. The ground of these caves still holds evidence of their experiments, small stones blackened with resin, fragments of burnt plant matter that scientists have analyzed to confirm what folklore had long suggested, that these fires were not meant only for warmth or cooking, but for something more deliberate, a kind of communication between humanity and the smoke that carried their consciousness towards something they understood as divine. Perhaps this was the first attempt to bridge the gap between the physical and the spiritual through intoxication, the first time human beings realized that altering their minds could feel like altering reality itself. The irony, of course, is that what began as a holy practice, as a ritual meant to connect people to gods and ancestors, would thousands of years later become a habit argued over by lawmakers, criminalized by governments, and fought over in courtrooms and parliaments across the world. In modern terms, it would be like discovering that humanity's first church, the very birthplace of religious experience, was also its first smoke lounge, a place where people gathered not just to pray, but to alter their consciousness in ways that made prayer feel more real, more immediate, more connected to the forces that governed existence. The act of burning itself carried deep meaning in those ancient times, because fire was not just a tool, but a symbol of life itself, a force that protected against the cold and the predators that prowled in darkness, a force that transformed raw meat into nourishment and hard seeds into fragrant smoke. To mix cannabis with fire was to merge comfort with mystery, practicality with transcendence, survival with spirituality, in a way that felt almost magical. The smoke lingered long after the flames died down, clinging to hair and skin, filling nostrils with its strange, calming scent, wrapping itself around the bodies of those who sat in the circle like an invisible blanket. It might have felt like a conversation between the living and the unseen, a dialogue conducted not in words but in breath, in the inhalation and exhalation that connected each person to the smoke, and through the smoke to something beyond themselves. Or perhaps it was a small rebellion against fear itself, a way of saying that even in a world ruled by danger and death, there could be moments of calm, moments where the constant vigilance required for survival could be set aside, if only briefly, if only for the duration of the ritual. For a brief moment in the heart of those caves, surrounded by darkness and uncertainty, the world grew softer, quieter, almost bearable. The hunger that gnawed at their bellies seemed less urgent, the fear that tightened their chests seemed less overwhelming, the exhaustion that weighed down their limbs seemed less crushing. In that space, in that smoke-filled moment, they found something that would define the human relationship with cannabis for millennia to come. The sense that relief was possible, that peace was attainable, even if only temporarily, even if only through the inhalation of smoke that rose from seeds thrown onto fire. Of course, they had no words for pleasure or addiction, no concepts that could separate the experience into categories of good or bad, healthy or harmful. Their understanding of mind and body was instinct alone, a knowledge built on what worked and what did not, on what helped them survive and what threatened their survival. A burning seed that made the night seem shorter, that made the darkness feel less oppressive, that made the fear recede even slightly, was miracle enough. They did not question it, did not analyze it, did not debate its moral implications. They simply kept burning, perhaps without even knowing why, driven by an instinct that told them this smoke brought something valuable, something worth repeating. The smoke became tradition, woven into the fabric of their communal life. The tradition became belief, a conviction that the ritual mattered, that the smoke carried power. And belief became survival, because in a world where meaning was scarce and comfort even scarcer, the rituals that brought people together, that gave them a sense of connection to something greater than themselves, were as essential to survival as food and shelter. When the winds changed and the herds moved on, when the seasons shifted and the tribe had to follow, they left behind nothing but faint traces of ash for future ages to uncover, silent testimony to rituals whose meaning would be lost, but whose presence would endure. To imagine those people sitting by the fire, wrapped in animal furs against the cold, their faces lit by the orange glow that pushed back the darkness, their eyes half closed as the smoke filled their lungs and their minds began to drift, is to glimpse the beginning of something far larger than they could have understood, something that would shape human culture and consciousness for thousands of years to come. They did not know of chemistry, of cannabinoids and receptors, of the complex interactions between plant compounds and human neurology. They had no understanding of medicine in the way we define it, no concept of spirituality as a separate realm of experience. Yet in that act of lighting a fire, throwing seeds onto the flames, inhaling the smoke, and surrendering to the haze that followed, they opened a door that humanity would never close again, a door that led to altered states of consciousness, to religious experience, to medical treatment, to recreational use, to all the ways that humans would learn to use plants to change how they felt, how they thought, how they perceived the world around them. It still feels strangely intimate to picture the first spark of curiosity that connected the human mind to smoke, as if even then, in those dark caves with no language to describe what was happening, people were searching for a way to feel less alone in their own thoughts, less trapped in their own fears, less overwhelmed by the sheer difficulty of existence. Thousands of years later, long after those caves had been abandoned and forgotten, we can still trace the path of that smoke through every culture that followed, watching as it moved from continent to continent, from ritual to ritual, from one meaning to another. From priests and healers who saw in it a connection to the divine, to kings and emperors who used it to ease pain and induce sleep, to commoners and laborers who found in it a brief respite from endless toil, the same instinct returned again and again: the need to burn, to breathe, and to believe that something unseen could soothe the mind and soften the harsh edges of reality. What was once a ritual born of darkness, of fear, of the desperate search for meaning in a meaningless world, would spread across continents and centuries, dressed in new meanings and new rituals, but always carrying the same ancient comfort, the promise that relief was possible, that peace could be found, that the mind did not have to remain trapped in its own suffering. The caves remain silent now, their ashes cold, their fires long extinguished, their secrets buried under layers of time and sediment. Yet the story of those burnt seeds lingers in the archaeological record, whispering to anyone willing to listen that even in prehistory, even before the first cities were built or the first alphabets invented, humans were drawn to escape the harshness of life, if only for a few breaths of smoke rising toward the unknown, toward the darkness above the cave where the stars shone cold and distant and indifferent to human suffering. The first traces of cannabis remind us that curiosity and comfort have always walked together hand in hand, that the drive to explore altered states of consciousness is not a modern phenomenon or a cultural aberration, but something fundamental to the human experience. They show us that even before civilization emerged, before agriculture transformed nomadic tribes into settled communities, before writing allowed ideas to be preserved and transmitted across generations, people sought peace through what they could not explain, through experiences that transcended language and logic. And somewhere between firelight and darkness, between the known world of hunger and danger and the unknown world of spirits and ancestors, they found it, if only for a moment, if only for the duration of the smoke that hung in the air before dissipating into nothing. The smoke of the Stone Age still drifts faintly through history, thin and ancient and almost invisible, carrying the memory of the first human who felt calm for no reason at all, who experienced a loosening of anxiety that had no obvious cause, who discovered that consciousness itself could be altered, that the mind was not fixed but fluid, not imprisoned but capable of transformation. The earliest fires revealed more than warmth and light. They revealed desire, the fundamental human desire to feel different, to feel better, to feel connected to something beyond the narrow confines of individual existence. From those embers scattered on cave floors, belief was born, a belief in the power of plants, in the efficacy of ritual, in the possibility of transcendence. And with it came the first addiction disguised as devotion, the first human dependency on a substance that promised relief and delivered just enough to keep people coming back, again and again, generation after generation. Somewhere beyond the ashes of those ancient fires, a new age waited, an age where smoke would no longer rise in caves, but in temples and palaces, under the gaze of gods carved from stone and painted with gold, where the ritual would become religion and the plant would become medicine, where human understanding would grow more sophisticated, but the fundamental desire would remain unchanged. The ancient Chinese did not stumble upon cannabis by accident, did not discover it through random experimentation or lucky coincidence. It appeared carefully recorded in their earliest medical texts, those fragile scrolls and bamboo strips where observation and superstition were woven together into a tapestry of healing wisdom that would influence medicine for thousands of years. The plant was called ma, a word that meant numbness but also carried connotations of balance, of the restoration of harmony to a body thrown into discord by illness or injury. To those early physicians who studied the flow of energy through the body, who saw disease as an imbalance rather than an invasion, cannabis was both a medicine and a mystery, a substance that could dull pain, calm the spirit, and open the mind to a kind of clarity that seemed almost supernatural. Its roots ran deep into the philosophy of harmony that governed Chinese thought, the belief that the body was a landscape of energy flowing through invisible channels, and that every illness represented a disruption of that flow, a blockage or excess that needed to be corrected. Cannabis, with its curious power to quiet pain and relax tense muscles, was believed to restore balance between motion and stillness, between the active yang energy and the receptive yin energy that needed to exist in perfect equilibrium for health to be maintained. The oldest references to the plant appear in texts attributed to Emperor Shen Nung, the mythical father of Chinese medicine, who is said to have tasted hundreds of herbs to determine their medicinal properties, sometimes poisoning himself in the process, but always recovering to record his findings for future generations. He described cannabis as a remedy that could heal hundreds of diseases, from fever that burned through the body to forgetfulness that clouded the mind, from pain that made movement impossible to restlessness that prevented sleep. Later healers expanded on these observations, writing of the plant's ability to ease pain and soften the body into rest, to calm agitated spirits and quiet troubled minds. They did not know its chemical nature, had no understanding of how cannabinoids interacted with receptors in the brain and nervous system, knew only that it could make suffering fade into a distance where the mind no longer reached, where pain became something observed rather than experienced. It is oddly comforting to think that thousands of years ago, on the other side of the world, people were already inventing ways to take the edge off existence, to make life a little more bearable through the careful application of plant medicine, even if they did not understand the mechanisms by which that medicine worked. In the time of the great physician Hua Tuo, who lived during the late Han Dynasty and became legendary for his surgical skill, cannabis became a tool of surgical courage, a way to perform procedures that would otherwise be impossible due to the patient's pain and movement. His legend tells of mixing powdered cannabis into wine, creating a concoction that he called ma fei san, which translates roughly to cannabis boiling powder, and giving it to patients before surgery. Under its spell, patients would fall into a state of deep relaxation bordering on unconsciousness, their bodies growing still, their awareness of pain diminishing to the point where Hua Tuo could cut flesh, remove tumors, and mend internal injuries without hearing screams of agony. This was not anesthesia as modern science understands it, not a complete elimination of consciousness and sensation, but something more primitive and uncertain, a state that existed somewhere between waking and sleeping, between awareness and oblivion. Some patients never woke from that state, their systems unable to recover from the combination of surgery and sedation. Others awoke praising the miracle that had spared them the agony they had expected to endure. In a world without morphine or chloroform, without any of the sophisticated anesthetic agents that modern medicine takes for granted, this fragile mixture of wine and cannabis was the closest thing to mercy that surgery could offer, the only way to perform procedures that required the patient to remain still while their body was violated by knife and needle. Hua Tuo's use of cannabis marked a quiet revolution in medical thinking, a revolution that suggested pain could be managed rather than merely endured, that surgery did not have to be an act of torture, that patients survived through sheer force of will. That belief alone, the notion that human intervention could spare people unnecessary suffering, placed him centuries ahead of his time, anticipating the development of anesthesia by more than 1,000 years. In modern comparison, it would be as if a field surgeon working in the Middle Ages had discovered general anesthesia using only herbs and intuition, while the rest of the world still relied on prayer and leather straps to keep patients from moving during surgery. His methods spread through stories more than through systematic teaching, passed from physician to apprentice in the oral tradition that preceded written medical texts. But the memory of his experiments endured long after his writings were lost and his formulas buried with him in a grave that has never been found. Beyond surgery, Chinese healers used cannabis to calm the mind and settle disturbed thoughts, to treat what they called excessive spirit, a condition where too much energy burned through the brain, causing restlessness, insomnia, and what we might today call anxiety or mania. They believed that cannabis cooled the heart in a metaphorical sense, not lowering body temperature, but reducing the intensity of emotional and mental disturbance, silencing the ghosts and demons that caused nightmares and intrusive thoughts. It was medicine for the unseen, for the soul as much as the body, for conditions that had no visible symptoms but caused suffering nonetheless. In a culture that valued order above chaos, that saw the ideal life as one of balance and moderation, this ability to bring stillness to an agitated mind was considered sacred, a power that connected the physician to the fundamental forces that governed existence. The body, like the empire itself, had to remain balanced between competing forces, and cannabis became one of the quiet guardians of that balance, a tool that physicians could use to restore harmony when internal storms threatened to tear the patient apart. Merchants sold dried cannabis flowers and seeds in small cloth bags at herbal markets that filled the streets of major cities, where the air hung thick with the scent of roots and resins and leaves, each promising health, though none could guarantee safety. Each bundle of herbs came with instructions passed down through generations, recipes that combined cannabis with other plants to treat specific conditions, though the dosages were approximate at best. There were no scales precise enough to measure exact quantities, no standardized preparations that ensured consistency from batch to batch, no warnings written on labels to alert patients to potential dangers. A handful of cannabis seeds might heal one person's insomnia while causing confusion and disorientation in another. Yet people trusted their healers with a faith that seems almost incomprehensible to modern minds trained to demand clinical trials and statistical proof, and healers trusted what experience whispered through generations, building a system of medicine that was fragile and imperfect but somehow managed to help more people than it harmed. The plant's dual nature puzzled many scholars who tried to understand its properties and predict its effects. Some claimed it brought enlightenment, opening the mind to insights that would otherwise remain hidden, allowing philosophers and poets to see connections between ideas that normal consciousness kept separate. Others called it dangerous to the mind, warning that excessive use could blur memory, make the tongue heavy and unresponsive, turn laughter into confusion, and cause a kind of mental fog that made clear thinking impossible. The plant's dual nature puzzled many scholars who tried to understand its properties and predict its effects. Some claimed it brought enlightenment, opening the mind to insights that would otherwise remain hidden, allowing philosophers and poets to see connections between ideas that normal consciousness kept separate. Others called it dangerous to the mind, warning that excessive use could blur memory, make the tongue heavy and unresponsive, turn laughter into confusion, and cause a kind of mental fog that made clear thinking impossible. It was medicine and poison in equal measure, its effects dependent on dose and circumstance and the individual constitution of the person taking it. Too much could blur memory and judgment, leaving patients unable to recall recent events or make sound decisions, slowing their reactions to the point where they became vulnerable to accidents and injury. But in moderation, in the careful doses prescribed by experienced physicians who knew how to balance benefit against risk, it was said to unlock deep calm and insight, to allow patients to rest in a way that ordinary sleep did not provide, to create a mental space where healing could occur. This tension between healing and harm, between medicine and intoxication, defined the plant's place in Chinese medical thought for centuries, creating a framework where cannabis was respected but not revered, used but not celebrated, always approached with the caution that any powerful substance demanded. To lose control of oneself was shameful in a culture that prized discipline and self-mastery above almost all other virtues. But to master the effects of the plant through careful dosing and proper preparation was considered a mark of wisdom, evidence that the physician understood the subtle balance between too much and too little that determined whether a medicine healed or harmed. To lose control of oneself was shameful in a culture that prized discipline and self-mastery above almost all other virtues. But to master the effects of the plant through careful dosing and proper preparation was considered a mark of wisdom, evidence that the physician understood the subtle balance between too much and too little that determined whether a medicine healed or harmed. Even within temples, where Buddhist and Taoist monks pursued spiritual enlightenment through meditation and ascetic practices, cannabis found a place, though its use was carefully regulated and surrounded by ritual. Monks burned small amounts in censers during meditation sessions, letting the smoke rise with their chants, twisting through beams of sunlight that cut across dim halls filled with the scent of incense and aged wood. They said the smoke cleared the mind of dust, using a metaphor that compared mental clutter to the physical dirt that accumulated in neglected spaces, helping them to glimpse truth without the pain and effort that usually accompanied deep meditation. The irony was profound and somehow perfect, that a plant used to escape the senses was also believed to sharpen them, that something that dulled ordinary awareness was thought to enhance spiritual perception. I cannot help but find it deeply human that even those who sought spiritual purity through renunciation and discipline, who gave up comfort and pleasure in pursuit of enlightenment, still found comfort in a bit of chemical assistance, in a plant that made the long hours of sitting meditation slightly more bearable and the insights slightly more accessible. Centuries passed like smoke dissipating in wind. Dynasties rose and fell in the pattern that defined Chinese history. Emperors built palaces that crumbled to dust, and through it all, the plant's reputation shifted like sand, never quite settling into a fixed position. Some emperors banned its use outside strictly controlled medical contexts, fearing its power to cloud judgment and undermine the discipline that held society together. Worried that widespread cannabis use would create a population too relaxed to defend the empire or too distracted to maintain the rigid social order that kept millions of people organized and productive. Others praised its benefits and ordered it cultivated in imperial gardens alongside other medicinal plants, recognizing that pain and insomnia afflicted even emperors, and that relief should be available to those who ruled as well as those who served. Cannabis moved quietly through households and hospitals and pharmacies, through prescriptions written in elegant calligraphy on rice paper, and prayers whispered in temples where smoke rose toward heaven. It never quite disappeared, never faded from use entirely, despite periodic attempts to restrict or control it. But it also never became fully embraced by mainstream culture, never achieved the status of essential medicine that would protect it from criticism and prohibition. It occupied a middle space, neither forbidden nor celebrated, tolerated but watched, useful but suspect, always hovering at the edges of acceptability. Through all its transformations and reimaginings, through all the changing dynasties and shifting attitudes, the core of the relationship remained the same. Cannabis offered relief in a world where pain was constant and control was fragile, where illness struck without warning and recovery was never guaranteed. It represented a small triumph of the human desire to soften reality, to make life a little more bearable, even if only for a short while, to create moments of peace in the midst of chaos. The physicians who prescribed it did not think in terms of addiction or vice, did not conceive of drug abuse as a moral failing or medical condition. They thought only of suffering and how to ease it, of patients who could not sleep or could not move without pain, of minds torn apart by anxiety or depression, and they offered what tools they had, imperfect as those tools might be. The story of cannabis in ancient China reveals more than the birth of a medicine or the development of medical knowledge. It shows us the first systematic attempts to understand the connection between mind and body, to recognize that mental suffering was as real and as worthy of treatment as physical pain, to see that the two were interconnected in ways that made separating them impossible. It demonstrates how deeply people feared pain, not just the physical sensation, but the existential suffering that came from living in bodies that hurt and minds that could not rest. The plant became a bridge between flesh and spirit, between what could be seen and measured and what could only be felt and described, between the material world of bones and organs and the immaterial world of thoughts and emotions. In the quiet rooms of healers where patients lay on wooden beds describing their symptoms, and in the smoky air of temples where monks sat in meditation seeking enlightenment, cannabis whispered the same promise it had whispered in Stone Age caves, that relief was possible if one dared to trust what could not be fully understood, if one was willing to surrender control in exchange for comfort, if one accepted that sometimes the path to healing required passing through states of consciousness that felt strange and unfamiliar. Cannabis entered Chinese history as a healer and remained as a companion to both body and belief, its smoke carrying not rebellion but reverence, not escape but endurance, not the desire to flee reality, but the need to make reality bearable. And though its meaning changed with time, shifting to accommodate new philosophies and new understanding, its purpose remained fundamentally unchanged across the centuries: to ease the unending ache of being human, to provide small moments of peace in lives filled with struggle, to offer hope that suffering did not have to be permanent or absolute. The ancient doctors saw more than a plant when they looked at cannabis. They saw a path to peace, a tool for restoring balance, a gift from nature that could help humanity bear the weight of consciousness. Their discoveries gave cannabis a sacred weight that would survive the fall of dynasties and the rise of new empires, that would carry across borders and oceans to influence medical systems far from China's boundaries. Yet beyond their temples and scrolls, beyond the careful observations recorded in medical texts that would be copied and recopied for generations, others would take this same plant and twist its use in new directions, finding in it not medicine but pleasure, not treatment but recreation, not balance but intoxication. Somewhere far from the empire's borders, in lands where different gods were worshipped and different philosophies governed life, new hands waited to light the same smoke for very different reasons: to discover their own meanings in the haze, to write their own chapters in the long history of humanity's relationship with this strange and powerful plant. In the heat and dust of ancient India, where the sun burned with an intensity that seemed almost divine, and the air shimmered with mirages that blurred the line between real and imagined, cannabis was not merely a plant, but a divine gift bestowed by gods who took pity on human suffering. It appeared in the sacred verses of the Vedas, those ancient hymns and philosophical texts that formed the foundation of Hindu thought, where sages wrote of 5 holy herbs that could bring happiness and liberation to those who used them properly. Among these sacred plants, bhang was called the herb of the gods, a bridge between mortal minds trapped in bodies and celestial understanding that transcended physical limitations. It was believed to be born from the body of the god Shiva himself, that wild and terrible deity who sat in eternal meditation atop mountains covered in snow, his throat blue from poison he had swallowed to save the world, his third eye closed to prevent its gaze from destroying creation. According to legend, Shiva drank bhang to stay calm during his meditation, to quiet the cosmic forces that churned within him, to maintain the stillness necessary for holding the universe in balance. To touch the plant was therefore to touch a fragment of the divine, to hold in human hands something that had originated in godly flesh. And to drink it was to taste serenity itself, to partake of the same substance that allowed a god to remain peaceful despite containing the power to destroy all existence. For thousands of years, cannabis became woven into the very fabric of Indian spiritual life, so deeply embedded that separating it from religion became impossible. Sadhus, those wandering monks who renounced worldly possessions and comforts in pursuit of enlightenment, carried cannabis in small clay pots during their pilgrimages across the subcontinent, mixing it into milk and water and spices to create a drink that cooled the body and quieted the restless chatter of thoughts that prevented meditation. The taste was bitter and earthy, the texture gritty with crushed plant matter, the effect gentle at first, but then deepening into a kind of trance where the boundaries of self seemed to dissolve. To them, this was not intoxication in the sense of losing control or becoming confused, but purification, a way to dissolve the illusion of separation between individual soul and universal consciousness, a means of achieving the goal that all spiritual practice aimed toward. The body would grow light as if gravity had loosened its grip. The mind would become heavy and slow as if thoughts were moving through water. And the soul, they said, would rise closer to truth, floating free of the anchors that normally kept it trapped in limited perception. It is somewhat amusing to imagine that enlightenment, in its earliest form, that ultimate goal of all spiritual seeking, may have begun not with years of austere discipline and self-denial, but with a sip of something that tasted like dirt mixed with devotion, like earth and heaven blended in a cup. During great festivals such as Holi, when colors filled the air and the normal rules of society were temporarily suspended in celebration of spring and renewal, cannabis took on a joyful form that had less to do with spiritual seeking and more to do with communal celebration. The bang drink was shared among crowds in the streets, poured from large clay pots into small cups that passed from hand to hand, rich and poor, high caste and low, all drinking together in a rare moment of equality. It softened tempers that might otherwise flare in the chaos of celebration, turned strangers into friends through the simple act of sharing, gave courage to dance and sing and play without the self-consciousness that normally governed public behavior. It is somewhat amusing to imagine that enlightenment, in its earliest form, that ultimate goal of all spiritual seeking, may have begun not with years of austere discipline and self-denial, but with a sip of something that tasted like dirt mixed with devotion, like earth and heaven blended in a cup. To refuse the drink was to refuse the spirit of celebration itself, to stand apart from the community at precisely the moment when community mattered most. Children watched as their elders laughed and swayed with a looseness that seemed almost magical. Their eyes glazed, not with the wildness of alcohol, but with a kind of peace, a gentleness that made them approachable in ways they normally were not. This was not vice but blessing, not debauchery but devotion expressed through the body's relaxation, a communal trance that wove the entire community together through shared chemistry and shared ritual. In temples dedicated to Shiva, which could be found in every village and city across India, priests prepared bhang with elaborate care, mixing the cannabis leaves and flowers with ghee and almonds and cardamom and honey, stirring the mixture slowly before sunrise while chanting prayers, creating something that was part food and part sacrament. The mixture was offered first to the deity, placed before statues of Shiva who sat cross-legged in eternal meditation, smoke from incense curling around the offering, before being distributed to worshippers as prasad, blessed food that carried the god's grace. The smoke of burning cannabis leaves also filled these temples, mingling with frankincense and sandalwood, creating an atmosphere so thick with fragrance that breathing itself became a form of worship. To inhale that smoke was to join the gods in their stillness, to forget for a moment the hunger and fear that defined mortal existence, to rest in the warmth of the sacred that seemed to emanate from the very walls. There was no shame in this act, no sense of transgression or moral failing. It was prayer made physical, faith carried on breath, devotion expressed through the simple act of inhaling smoke that had been blessed and offered to the divine before being shared with humanity. In modern comparison, it would be like walking into a church and finding that communion included not just bread and wine, but a drink specifically designed to alter consciousness, to bring worshippers into a state where they could feel more directly connected to the divine presence they came to honor. The entire congregation sharing this substance together, young and old, men and women, all experiencing the same gentle dissolution of ego and anxiety that made the teachings about universal consciousness and divine unity feel not like abstract philosophy, but like lived reality. As centuries passed and empires rose and fell across the Indian subcontinent, cannabis became embedded in every level of society, from the highest philosophical discussions to the most practical daily concerns. Farmers used it to ease pain after long hours laboring in fields under a sun that showed no mercy, rubbing cannabis paste into aching joints and drinking weak bhang to help them sleep despite bodies that screamed with exhaustion. Soldiers drank it before battle to steady nerves that might otherwise fail, to find courage in the face of death, to achieve the kind of calm detachment that made it possible to stand firm when everything in their bodies told them to run. Healers prescribed it for sleeplessness that no amount of exhaustion could cure, for fevers that burned through the body without breaking, for conditions of the mind that had no visible cause but made life unbearable nonetheless. Poets and mystics praised cannabis as a key to understanding existence itself, as a substance that could unlock doors of perception that normally remained sealed, allowing glimpses of truth that ordinary consciousness kept hidden. It was medicine and comfort and revelation bound together in one green leaf, existing simultaneously in all these roles without any sense of contradiction. The line between religion and recreation was never drawn clearly in Indian culture, never codified into law or doctrine because the entire framework of understanding was different. Life itself was seen as a kind of illusion, a dream from which one needed to awaken, and anything that helped pierce that illusion, anything that revealed the temporary and constructed nature of everyday reality was potentially valuable. To live was to endure suffering. That was the fundamental teaching of the Buddha, and it echoed through Hindu thought as well. And to endure was to seek relief, whether that relief came from gods or herbs or rituals or meditation. The methods mattered less than the goal, which was always the same: to find peace in a world that offered precious little of it, to achieve moments of clarity and calm in the midst of chaos and suffering. The connection between cannabis and Shiva gave the plant a moral protection that made it almost impossible to prohibit or condemn. When challenged by outsiders who came to India and were shocked by the open use of intoxicants in religious settings, defenders would simply point to the mythology and ask a question that had no good answer. If the Lord Shiva himself partakes, if the greatest of all gods uses this plant to maintain his meditation, how can it possibly be wrong for his devotees to follow his example? No king dared to forbid what was so thoroughly woven into the fabric of faith, what had been sanctified by thousands of years of tradition and millions of practitioners. Yet the tolerance had its limits, its boundaries that were understood if not always clearly articulated. Those who used too much, who let cannabis dominate their lives to the point where they could no longer function or contribute to society, were seen as having lost their way, as drifting away from the discipline and self-control that spiritual practice required. Too little use, on the other hand, might suggest a lack of devotion or an unwillingness to fully surrender to the divine, a holding back that prevented true spiritual progress. As with all sacred things, balance was everything, the middle path that Buddhism taught about, the moderation that allowed one to use the plant's power without being consumed by it. To find that perfect measure, to know exactly how much to take and when and in what context, was itself seen as a kind of wisdom, as evidence that one had learned to live in harmony with forces that could help or harm depending on how they were approached. Travelers from other lands, merchants and missionaries, and eventually colonizers, wrote with fascination tinged with disapproval about India's relationship with cannabis, about the calm intoxication that seemed to pervade certain segments of society. They saw people moving slowly through their days, with eyes half closed and smiles faint but sincere, exhibiting a kind of peace that seemed alien to the goal-driven, productivity-obsessed mindset of European culture. Travelers from other lands, merchants and missionaries and eventually colonizers, wrote with fascination tinged with disapproval about India's relationship with cannabis, about the calm intoxication that seemed to pervade certain segments of society. They saw people moving slowly through their days, with eyes half closed and smiles faint but sincere, exhibiting a kind of peace that seemed alien to the goal-driven, productivity-obsessed mindset of European culture. It was not the wild drunkenness they knew from taverns and alehouses, not the loud aggression and loss of control that characterized alcohol intoxication in their own societies, but rather a measured stillness that seemed to erase pain without inducing pleasure, to bring contentment without excitement. The plant's reputation began to spread beyond India's borders through these accounts, though its meaning was almost always lost in translation, filtered through cultural assumptions that had no framework for understanding how a drug could be both sacred and commonplace, both spiritually significant and practically useful. What for the Indian sadhu was a tool of prayer and path to enlightenment, for the British colonial observer was simply another example of Eastern decadence and spiritual confusion, proof that these cultures needed the firm guidance of Western rationality and Christian morality to save them from their own confused philosophies. I find it strangely beautiful that what others viewed with suspicion or contempt, what outsiders saw as evidence of moral weakness or philosophical error, the practitioners themselves experienced as connection, as a direct link to something divine that transcended words and concepts, as peace itself made tangible through chemistry and ritual. The ritual surrounding bong endured for millennia with remarkably little change, passed down through generations as carefully as the sacred texts themselves. During religious processions, devotees carried clay cups of the drink through crowded streets, chanting the name of Shiva as they drank, their voices rising together in a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, deep and rhythmic and hypnotic. The mixture varied from region to region, each area having its own traditional recipe, its own preferred proportions of cannabis to milk to spices, but the essential elements remained constant: The cannabis leaves ground to paste, the milk to carry it, the spices to make it palatable, the prayers to make it sacred. It was a recipe for transcendence that could be made in any home with ingredients available to even the poorest families. A democratization of spiritual experience that made enlightenment theoretically accessible to everyone regardless of wealth or status or education. Elders taught the young not to fear the plant but to respect it, to approach it with the same reverence one would show to any powerful force, to understand that it was like fire or the ocean, capable of great benefit but also great harm if treated carelessly or arrogantly. The teaching was passed down through participation rather than lecture, through the experience of taking bong together during festivals and ceremonies, through watching how the adults in one's life related to the plant with a mixture of familiarity and respect. Even now, in remote villages where modernity has penetrated slowly if at all, the preparation of bong continues quietly and largely unchanged by time. The same rituals performed in the same way they have been for countless generations. The pestle grinding the leaves in the mortar, the milk slowly mixed in, the prayers whispered over the mixture, the offering made before consumption. All of it preserved as carefully as any museum piece, but alive and functional, still serving the same purpose it served 1,000 years ago. Beyond its spiritual role, cannabis served intensely practical purposes that had nothing to do with religion or philosophy. In the brutal heat of the Indian summer, when temperatures climbed to levels that made physical labor almost impossible and heat stroke was a constant danger, bong cooled the body in ways that went beyond mere temperature regulation. It made the heat feel less oppressive, made the exhaustion feel less crushing, made it possible to continue working when every instinct screamed to stop and rest. Laborers who could not afford medicine or doctors found in bong a relief that was within their means, something they could make themselves or buy for a few coins at any market. It dulled the pain of injuries and chronic conditions, slowed racing thoughts that prevented sleep, gave endurance to bodies pushed beyond what should have been endurable. For the poor, who made up the vast majority of India's population throughout its history, cannabis was not a luxury or an indulgence, but the closest thing to medical care they would ever receive, the only intervention between themselves and suffering that many would ever know. For the wealthy, who had access to doctors and imported medicines and all the comforts that money could buy, bong was something different, a doorway to meditation and introspection, a tool for the kind of spiritual exploration that required leisure and freedom from the immediate pressures of survival. The presence of bong in Indian culture across all these contexts, from the highest philosophical discussions to the most desperate attempts to ease physical pain, demonstrates something profound about how deeply humans can merge faith and chemistry, spirituality and medicine, the search for meaning and the search for comfort. It was a prayer one could drink, a ritual that required no temple or priest or holy book, a direct connection to the divine that could be accessed by anyone with access to the plant and the knowledge of how to prepare it. It offered connection to the gods for those who sought enlightenment, calm to the weary for those who needed rest, unity to the crowds who gathered for festivals, a sense of belonging in a world that often felt fragmented and hostile. No law or empire or colonial power could fully erase it because it answered needs that were older than any civilization and deeper than any ideology. Needs that emerged from the fundamental conditions of human existence: the need for relief from pain, the need for hope in the face of suffering, the need to believe that life contained more than just struggle and eventual death. India's sacred herb stands as perhaps history's longest continuous human relationship with cannabis, spanning thousands of years without any significant interruption, surviving invasions and famines and the rise and fall of countless kingdoms and empires. It was not a phase or a trend or an experiment, but a permanent feature of the cultural landscape, as integral to Indian civilization as the rivers that watered the crops or the monsoons that brought life-giving rain. The relationship was not about rebellion against authority, not about escaping reality or rejecting social norms, but about finding a way to live within reality's harshness, to make peace with suffering that could not be eliminated, to maintain faith in the face of evidence that suggested faith was foolish. It proved that intoxication and holiness need not be enemies, but could be twins born from the same fundamental longing, the longing to transcend the limited and painful experience of being trapped in a body, to glimpse something larger and more beautiful than the everyday struggle for survival. The faith that surrounded cannabis in India transformed a simple plant into a doorway to heaven, made a weed into a sacrament, turned chemistry into theology. From the hymns of the Vedas to the streets filled with colored powder during Holi, from temples clouded with incense to homes where families prepared the drink together, cannabis lived as part of the people's heartbeat, as natural and necessary as breath itself. But while India drank its peace in temples and celebrated with bhang in the streets, another land would soon discover the same plant through very different circumstances, would burn it not for transcendence, but for something raw and immediate, for purification after violence, for cleansing after the horror of battle. In the desert winds of Africa and across the vast plains beyond India's borders, in lands where different gods were worshipped and different philosophies governed life, cannabis smoke would rise for very different reasons, carrying different meanings, serving different purposes, adding new chapters to the long and complicated story of humanity's relationship with this plant that seemed to offer whatever each culture needed most.